Okay, the next team we're going to cover is Ole Miss. This one is kind of a team that overachieved and underachieved at the same time last year. They started really strong. I want to say they were a top 10 team as late as week 8, week 9 undefeated. And nobody kind of gave them a ton of respect for it. And ultimately, it kind of turned out to be with good reason. They finished fourth in the SEC West behind the two behemoths in LSU and Alabama, and then also Mississippi State, who they actually dropped their rivalry game to there at the end of the season. But there's a couple things about this team. First, being the best running back in the country, arguably outside of potentially Blake Corum up at Michigan. Definitely in the SEC is Quinshon Judkins. He split reps with Zach Evans last year in this Ole Miss offense and was still able to put up kind of disgustingly big numbers. He rushed for over 1,000 yards. He led the SEC in rushing. Just like Harold Perkins earlier, this guy was a freshman. So you have to expect it's only going to go up from here.
Quinshon's a guy we have to probably really consider for a Heisman Trophy at the running back position, depending on how Ole Miss season goes. If they overachieve and have a really good year, there's no way this team does that in the SEC West without him having a really good year. I think you have to really consider him as a Heisman candidate at that point. But Ole Miss, interesting situation, kind of quarterback this year. Jaxson Dart is a returning starter for Lane Kiffin. However, not currently named the starter going into this year. They brought in two transfer quarterbacks, one being Spencer Sanders from Oklahoma State, who had a lot of success at Oklahoma State. And it was kind of a interesting move in the offseason when it did happen, because it was like, oh, they're bringing in a guy to challenge the incumbent starter, which you don't typically see that. And then they also brought in a former 5-star and Walker Howard, who transferred from LSU. Not as much of a known quantity. So that one more standard with kind of what we're seeing. He probably thinking he will fill in for Jaxson Dart here at some point. But Spencer Sanders was definitely an interesting move to transfer to Ole Miss with a returning starter at quarterback.
Yeah, and there was a lot of confusion kind of surrounding that decision, especially from the Oklahoma State fan base. There were kind of a lot of rumors circulating, this was NIL related, what kind of his motivations were actually for leaving Oklahoma State. And then he held out for a really long time on his decision. A lot of the quarterbacks, even though his numbers would kind of put him atop the transfer quarterback rankings, a lot of quarterbacks made their moves before he did. So I don't think we've gotten the full story there yet. I don't know if we ever will. But regardless, he's here now. Jaxson Dart last year, not as great a passer as I probably would have expected, but I think he actually overachieved a lot as a runner. He put up a ton of yards on the ground. It was kind of a three-headed rushing attack there. I mentioned Judkins and Evans, but Jaxson Dart was running the ball really strongly as well. Flip side to that is that's what Spencer Sanders does extremely well also.
With a little bit bigger frame, different style runner than Jaxson Dart is. I think the thing that Ole Miss is looking for in fall camp out of Jaxson Dart is probably to be some more consistency. He has the ability to flash and make those high level plays, but I think they're looking for some consistency, in which Spencer Sanders has had some up and down at Oklahoma State, but he's a guy you know what you're going to get. There's a lot less up and down roller coaster type play than there was with Jaxson Dart this past year. But I think if Jaxson Dart's performing at that top, he can really flash. He can really shine. So we'll see how that plays out.
You mentioned Walker Howard up at the top, the LSU transfer is a former 5-star recruit. He's a big body. I think he would be ready to play some places. I don't think he's going to factor into this quarterback race a ton this year, barring some kind of injuries. But with that being said, I did want to note, especially we were talking earlier about Alabama and Ty Simpson in that mix. With the transfer portal, the way these guys can move around, I think you're going to see a lot more pressure to play quarterbacks early. This is a guy, 5-star, that came into LSU, thought he was going to have a chance to play pretty early. They ended up bringing in Jaden Daniels as a transfer, which obviously slipped him at least one spot down the depth chart. Decided he was looking for a new home in the offseason. No, discredit to him. Go get your money and go try to get somewhere you can play. However, I think that's going to be a lot more pressure on coaches, and Ty Simpson, I think, is a perfect example at Alabama. You'll see, we'll talk about the quarterback situation at Georgia later. Brock Vandegrift and Gunnar Stockton, both highly touted young quarterbacks that are going to want to play as soon as they can.
And I think you're seeing that kind of across the country in a lot of these quarterback battles, if you will. There's a lot that are being kind of named three man battles, but they're truly 2-man battles with a young gun that I think the coaches are trying to get as involved and get as many reps with the ones as makes sense to try and give them a bone to chew on, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, the pessimist in me would say they're running these faux quarterback competitions to keep the number 2 and number 3 guys who think they should be number 1s on campus for another fall, and ensure they've got the quality backup, and then also they may get the offseason to change their mind.
Definitely true, and I think that there's some of that is they're gonna drag these battles out a little bit to try and challenge to really set up who's gonna win. I think the tricky part is these teams, these coaches, once they pick one, they need to give these guys a little bit longer of a leash because typically a quarterback is not a position where you want guys on a short leash. They usually don't perform very well in that scenario. And you definitely don't want to split the reps with the ones during the season with a quarterback.
So enough about the quarterback race. The other interesting piece for Ole Miss on the offensive side, at least, is wide receiver position. Not the biggest names coming out of the draft, but some pretty highly rated receiver prospects. Malik Heath and Jonathan Mingo both got drafted. They had some pretty big years and were really steady hands on the outside for Ole Miss. But what they did do, and I credit Lane Kiffin, is go out and utilize the transfer portal to the fullest extent. They got some guys you may have never heard of, but are some really talented guys who more or less dominated in the group of 5. So they got Trey Harris out of Louisiana Tech, Zachary Franklin out of UTSA. For whatever reason, last year I ended up watching, had to been 4, 5, 6 UTSA games. They were a really fun team to watch, and Zachary Franklin was a big part of it. Really, really talented wide receiver. And then they also got Caden Prescorn, who's a tight end out of Memphis. So some group of 5 guys that you may never have heard of, but they put up some big numbers last year, and I think they're going to slot in nicely and get pretty close, if not overtake what Malik Heath and Jonathan Mingo were able to give last season.
Yeah, I think truly with a team like Old Miss and a coach like Lane Kiffin is can he get these guys, these transfers in this new era to play together and come together as a team. And I think through spring ball that's really important, but that's really made in fall camp. As you and I both know, that fall camp is what makes your team. It's what sets the culture for the entire year. Things can go very poorly in fall camp or they can go very well. It's really up to the head coach. Has a lot to do with that. And I think he is a guy that probably can get all these personalities to play together, these new personalities. But just an interesting, unique challenge in the new age of college football and really college sports. You're seeing it across all sports, but it's an interesting challenge that these coaches are going to face over the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, for sure. For me and Ole Miss, I have them slotted finishing 8-4, 9-3, that kind of territory. They've got a lot of games that they could lose this season, and a lot of it, just like every year, a big question mark coming into the season is going to be defense for Lane Kiffin team. He devotes a lot of his energy and resources into the offense.
Yep.
They brought in some nice transfers on the defensive side. Ultimately, too, in the end, I think this quarterback battle may kind of take its toll in the locker room. Something that doesn't get talked about a ton in preseason, but if you're not decisive and quick with those actions, naming that quarterback, you've got somebody who's thought of as sort of a legend in the Oklahoma State community coming in. I'm sure there's some guys in the locker room that know he's the guy. I'm sure there's some guys in the locker room that are, bought in on their incumbent starter, Jaxson Dart. And there's probably even some younger guys who would like to see Walker Howard get some reps. So if that situation isn't handled right, you can see a locker room really fall apart in those kind of
Yeah,
situations.
and the hope is for the coach, right? Like we've seen this before in the past. By fall camp, you kind of the team kind of has their guy who they think is going to be the starter, or at least the majority of the team is typically thinking one way because we are all out there. We all see it. All the players see the play. They all see it, and they they'll have their guy. You'll see it. The receivers definitely will kind of lead the coach in the right direction as to who is going to play. But hopefully they can get that worked out. To kind of piggyback on what you said, I think if they do figure that out, I think honestly the sky kind of peaks for them at like a 10-2 type regular season. I don't think there's any possible way with as big of a question mark as they have on defense, that they can run the table in the SEC West. And I don't think with the rest of the teams that are there that they can make the conference title, but they're definitely a team that can ruin a lot of seasons. They have a chance to ruin some seasons in the SEC West, but I just don't trust them to really to do much more than peak at 10-2, but probably closer to that 7-5, 8-4 range.